kick off just to provide kind of a little bit of context. So I'll just start really by just throwing out 5 or 6 points maybe that sometimes are not given the emphasis perhaps that they should be in Brussels. First of all, I suppose I'm Irish myself, speaking from an Irish perspective, I think it's essential that some sort of Brexit does happen. Be it hard Brexit, soft Brexit, disorderly Brexit, perfectly orderly Brexit. But I think anybody who spent a significant part of time recently in the UK would argue that both for the societal cohesion of the United Kingdom and for the internal workings of the European Union, that some sort of Brexit is necessary. And it's very easy, I find, in Brussels that, it's very easy to almost ridicule the Tories and Boris Johnson and things that have happened since 2016, but actually that approach gets us nowhere. The second point I throw out there is that I think it's important that the EU doesn't become too complacent. I think a feeling has built up in Brussels that, the hard Brexiteers, the populists said that Brexit would be the start of an avalanche, that we would have, other separatist parties in France, in Italy, and in many other countries, and that hasn't happened. Rather, what we've seen is some sort of reverse solidarity, where I think everybody, including people in Brussels, are surprised by the degree of unity that the EU has shown with regard to the Brexit negotiations. But what I would say is that I would be careful, because many of the deep-seated socio-economic factors that underpin Brexit are still relevant, both in Britain and in many other member states in the European Union. So we're talking about huge wealth inequalities, prolonged austerity, an established, at this stage, political presence on the national political scene, and a huge increase in the intergenerational divide. Just 3 more points before I open it out to the panel. The EU is really going to change significantly after Brexit, whether we like it or not. I think we've already seen the negotiations with the MFF, with the next EU budget. Something is going to have to change there. The obvious policy area is security and defence. We're losing probably our most competent and extensive security and defence member of the European Union, but also, as I mentioned, in things like trade, neighbourhood policy, and the single market, which we're going to discuss about today. First of all, another point is that although much of the debate over the last year has been about the Irish border, Brexit will actually affect every member state in different ways. It will affect some through trade. It will impact some when it comes to free movement of labour. We shouldn't forget that Britain was one of only 3 countries in the early 2000s to open their borders to the new entrants immediately, to the new entrants from Central and Eastern Europe, along with Sweden and Ireland. And the last point, which I think is often glossed over, is that Brexit will make the EU weaker among every metric. The consensus in Brussels, and a certain part of Brussels, would say that that's a good thing and that we will have a renewed Franco-German axis to guide the integration process. Well, I'm not so sure about that, as events over the last 6 months, or maybe even the last 6 days, when it comes to enlargement, the future of the Eurozone, many other topics. I'm not quite sure that that's going to be the beacon for integration that many people assume. And also, I think small countries such as Ireland might be a little bit wary of a European Union stripped of the UK, because the UK has generally been a big supporter of the community method and of dividing out the power in Brussels. But I think that's enough. But that was just a few points to kick everything off. Paddy, I might come to you first. I suppose you're from the coal face of where the sticking points on Brexit are happening. As I said, you're here in a personal capacity, so I don't expect you to speak for the International Fund, but maybe you can just maybe talk about some of the issues that are core to the negotiations that are going on at the moment, challenges and the tensions that are there on the island of Ireland. And maybe if you want, you can just give a brief description of what the International Fund was to highlight your experience, even though you're here in a personal capacity.
Thanks, Johan. And just not was, still is, hopefully, when I left Ireland. I've been involved in cross-border politics on a small p in Ireland since the Anglo-Irish Agreement of '85, right through the Good Friday Agreement, and right up until now. The focus of what we've been asked to do by the British Irish governments, and heavily supported by EU, United States, Canada, and New Zealand, was to make sure that the agreements were felt within communities that had suffered most from the troubles. I could go on a lot about that, but that's in essence that's the role we play and the role we currently play. We talk to the people that feel that Brexit is going to affect them most, especially in terms of identity and culture. Try and briefly tell you why the border matters a bit more maybe than anyone would have expected it to. That is, anyone who wasn't familiar with the island of Ireland. We currently have a situation of 1,003 days without a government in Northern Ireland, and Brexit. The lack of government leaves a huge gap. You can't have a functioning society without a functioning democracy. That gap is partly filled by participative democracy, and communities have done that really, really well. The balance is being filled by a re-emergence of paramilitarism, which is something that no one wants to see. Add to that Brexit, which makes things very uncertain, and that uncertainty means that people's identities, whether you feel British or Irish, or under the Good Friday Agreement, where you could have felt both, has come under a lot of pressure, and that's in essence where the tension is about the border. And I use the terms loosely because everyone else uses them. The term nationalist and unionist, they're no longer that valid. There's a huge other in Northern Ireland. That's important to say. However, people vote in blocks, but they don't live in blocks and they don't discuss things in blocks. So that's an important thing to know about Northern Ireland. That dynamic has changed. However, what the challenge on the island is how does the EU protect the integrity of the single market and the customs union, and as members, that's something that's a responsibility of the Irish government. I don't think anyone ever noticed that the only land border was going to be on the island of Ireland, and against that we have to try and ensure that the identities of people on the island are protected. Everyone has a right to aspire on the island to be British, Irish, or both. My children have British and Irish passports. It's for me it's quite a normal thing, but that's not that usual. So where we find ourselves in a situation where how do you not have a border to protect the integrity of the single market and the customs union on the island of Ireland? How does that happen? And that's in the essence, that's the sticking point. You can see the attempts that have been made to do that have all fallen foul. The economics of the border will work themselves out. I lived on the border through every iteration of it, from very, very difficult borders, high security borders. Economics will eventually work out, and you can see it playing itself out. What doesn't work out, and I'll be finishing this point, which doesn't work out so easily is the conceptual border, the emotional border, the border that people believe defines their identity, whether it's north, south, etc. So our challenge is, how do we ensure that that inter-community tension stays down, that relationships between Northern Ireland and the Republic get back to where they were heading, and maybe most of all, how do we re-establish the East-West relations, the relationships between Ireland and Britain? And we saw a little bit of that in the world over in Liverpool, but that's a big challenge for us. So maybe just leave it there on.
Yeah, Paddy, just a follow-on question. How would you kind of assess the mood in kind of the border regions? Do you think that there is like an acceptance on both sides that the preferred solution would be no hard border?
I mean, the preferred solution for most people is that there would be no Brexit. But I do take your point now that it's got to where it is. Then some border is necessary. And I think we should all remember that this is democracy in action for the first time in Europe. Every other time that European countries didn't agree with each other, it wasn't a democratic solution they chose. So that's a really important thing to say about both the British government, whatever way you want to think about them, and the EU. This has been done through democratic processes. To answer your question, hard, absolutely. Now, the concept of a hard border, the closer you get to the wound, the more pain there is. People only see a hard border as they remember it worst, and that's when there were army checkpoints, customs checkpoints, police checkpoints. And that's the bit that people find difficult to reconcile. Once you mention hard border, it's physical infrastructure. And it's very hard to get people away from that, because that's traditionally how they understand the border to be in Ireland.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Paddy. Johan, I might just bring you in here. Paddy mentioned, that at the crux of the whole thing about the border is protecting the single market and the customs union. As I said previously, Britain, I think, has generally been viewed as a supporter of the single market right back to the days of Thatcher. So I'm just wondering, if we imagine an EU where there is no Britain, where there is a Brexit, they're not in the single market, how will that
look like?
Exactly, and how will it affect the future development of the single market? Because really, I think you've written recently for the EPC that at the core of the EU, at the core of all the wealth and all the wealth that's been generated is the single market. So will Britain leaving give a new impetus, or will it actually have the opposite?
So I would actually argue that, because one element is to say what impact Brexit will have on the single market and on the EU. Yeah. But actually, I would already argue that it has already had an impact. And if you look at the talks and the negotiations that led up to the von der Leyen Commission, if you look at the debate that is currently ongoing because of the mission letters, because of the future commissioners, there's a lot of focus on industrial policy. There's a lot of focus on what the French government and the German government has been arguing for. And moving a little bit away from the pure focus on single markets as such, where the UK was one of the strongest voices in Europe on that. So there was the UK in partnership with countries like the Netherlands, the Nordic countries, and the Eastern European countries that had a strong voice in favor of that. But what we see now is that von der Leyen has picked up a lot of issues that were proposed by the French and the Germans, not everything, because there are issues like, we would know, competition policy that are a little bit tricky and will have to have a lot of thought through in negotiations. But we see that the big focus here is on what has been talked about in terms of technological sovereignty, industrial policy, China policy, a lot of issues that have been put on the table by other countries than the UK. So the UK has already been a little bit outside of that debate already, I would argue. But obviously, in terms of economic terms, the impact will be direct, and it depends on whether it will be a soft Brexit, a hard Brexit, which obviously we don't know yet. The repercussions are between 2 and 10%, which is very diverse on the UK GDP, according to different scenarios and different studies. It varies a lot across member states as well, between much less, I have to say, between 0 point something and 2%, depending obviously the countries that are closest to the UK and that are most integrated in value chains coming out of the UK and into the UK will be most impacted, obviously. But as you said, it will impact all countries and it will impact all member states as well, even if the UK will be the most impacted. And then the last element I would like to say, and this is again going back to the fact that the UK was a strong voice in the single market in Europe, is that as many underline, the single market is an evolving process. It can never be completed as such, but it has to evolve. And if you look at the single market we have in Europe, most of it is about goods. The single market for services is not nearly complete, even if we know that most EU economies are mostly service economies, that 90% of jobs created today are created in the service sector. Still, the single market is mostly about goods. So there's a need to push the single market ahead, and I see that as a big challenge with the UK leaving, because the UK was a strong voice in more harmonization, more liberalization in the single market. So that certainly will affect as well the evolvement of the single market. And I also would like to add the link between single market and trade. Because when the EU goes abroad and negotiates free trade agreements, the UK was not only a strong voice in favor of more free trade agreements and more negotiations, but it was also a big economy. And what the package that the EU could offer in terms of negotiating a free trade agreement was big, because you also had the UK economy. You will lose that when you go abroad negotiating new free trade agreements. So that will be the package, the negotiation position that the EU will have when going abroad and negotiating will obviously be less interesting because of Brexit.
And just as a follow-on, I'm just thinking, you mentioned industrial policy and the big debate about China and how suddenly we're going to build all these European champions. But I'm thinking, doesn't Britain leaving the EU make that a lot more complicated because of the industrial expertise that Britain has? I'm just thinking about what even is going to happen to Airbus. I think a lot of the wing production and stuff is carried out in the UK.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, if you want to create a major industrial conglomerate in, I don't know, whatever, heavy engineering or whatever, actually, when we're talking about European champions without Britain, we're actually talking about French and German champions.
Absolutely, and I think it might be easier to define an industrial strategy at the EU level, but it doesn't mean that the industrial policy will be better.
Yeah.
Because obviously, and that's not only for industrial policy, but for all policies, the UK leaving is not a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. Professor, if I could bring you in now, just to follow on from Johan about, you mentioned trade and how Europe can be, perceived. I think, what is your opinion on how Brexit will impact on how, I suppose two parts. How will it impact on how the EU is perceived by its immediate neighbourhood? And also, will it impact on how the EU can and will seek to project its power in both the eastern neighbourhood, but also with countries like Switzerland and EFTA?
Well, as Johan already said, I think the Brexit is a lose-lose game for everybody. And it will certainly have a big impact on trade policy. He already hinted at two factors. One is internally, because the UK has been more in the free trader camp in the northern member states group, and that would of course potentially affect the outlook of the trade policy versus the more protectionist member states in various areas. And then also externally, of course, because the attractiveness of the internal market is shrinking. It's smaller, and that will, again, as he said, translate into less bargaining power of the European Union vis-à-vis third countries, be it neighboring countries or further afar. Of course, it all depends on the future economic partnership between the UK and the EU. We don't know. So it could well be that could, help remedy some of these issues. Because currently, if you just look at trading goods, I think the UK would be the third largest partner of the EU after US and China, just looking at the statistics from last year. Whereas, of course, on the other side, for the UK, the EU is by far the most important trading partner, like more than 50% of the goods go to the EU. So, and what the UK has been, just as a footnote, if I may, has been trying to do is to kind of replicate, or what they call roll over, the existing trade agreements that the EU has and negotiate bilateral ones. And I think the UK has already realized in some cases that its bargaining power is not the same as the EU's, and some countries seize the opportunity to ask for more concessions from the UK and not just copy-paste the agreement as it was. So, of course, for the UK, it has also implications. And then for the neighbourhood, of course, it depends a bit on what you're looking at the candidate countries, like the Western Balkans. I mean, they still want to join with or without the UK, if I may say so. Of course, the balance within the EU is changing a bit because the British have traditionally been rather in favor of widening the European Union. And as we just saw this week, you hinted at it as well in your introduction. It might become a bit more difficult because France is now blocking Albania and North Macedonia's accession. Well, we'll find out later this week, maybe, in the European Council what's going to happen. But in the past, the British always tried to counterbalance a bit. Turkey is a different game. I mean, Turkey has itself taken out of the accession, if I may say so, and it's a big country, so the issues are quite different depending on which candidate countries you look at. And in the European neighbourhood policy, so the broader neighbourhood to the south and east of the EU, of course it also makes a difference. And I also think of the budget, as you mentioned previously, the development policy, which is another, which is a policy that is very close to trade policy in many areas of the world, and the British have always been championing using trade for development purposes, having a very progressive and pragmatic approach to development policy, even though it's a shared competence, unlike trade. I think this might also have an impact then, for instance, for Commonwealth countries, which are part of the African, Caribbean, Pacific group. The EU is currently negotiating a new relationship with them, and if, of course, the UK will be out of that, it's not just resources that are lost, but also, there are special relationships historically, etc., that will certainly change the future relationship with this group of countries as well.
And do you think, just in relation to trade, do you think that there is a potential for significant conflict? I'm just thinking...
Between the EU and the UK?
Yeah, I saw the comments, I think, of Angela Merkel this week, but I'm just thinking, the Brexiteers, number one on their list, what's going to make Britain great again, is a new Anglo-American trade deal, right?
Good luck.
This is going to deliver the future. But I presume that, I'm not sure what the official position of the EU is, whether, TTIP will be, risen from the dead in a different shape or form. But we will have an Irishman as EU Trade Commissioner.
Yep.
So is Washington probably like the next likely place of conflict between the UK and the EU?
Well, I think it will depend on the future economic relationship between the UK and the EU. But of course, now the British government has said they would like to have a special relationship trade deal with the US. It's going to be difficult with the Trump administration for sure. Also because the UK will be in the weaker position for the negotiations, obviously. When it comes to transatlantic US-EU relations, I think TTIP is dead for the time being, but there are negotiations going on since last year when President Juncker went to Washington to try to prevent a trade war across the Atlantic. they had an agreement to negotiate. The problem is that they don't agree on what they agreed on anymore.
Okay.
So, or more concretely, whether agriculture would be part of the negotiations or not. The EU says no, and the Americans say yes. So they're currently a bit stuck. And then, as you already mentioned, we have, of course, the trade disputes, like the Boeing Airbus subsidies case, which, so the US has been authorized by the WTO to retaliate in tariffs, and next year, so they're using that to put up the pressure at the negotiation table, but next year there will be another case, the reverse case, and it looks like the EU will win against the US for the very same industry, very same case. So, well, it might take half a year, I don't know, so they could also retaliate a bit later because both sides are subsidizing their aircraft industries. So I think that would actually make sense to come to a negotiated agreement in such circumstances, but we will have to see. I find both the US and to a lesser degree the UK a bit unpredictable in these times. So it's a bit difficult to foresee what might happen.
But just an interesting statistic for people when we talk about the reality of where the UK's trade goes is that in 2012, which is quite recent, Britain exported more to Ireland than to the BRICS combined. So that's Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So for all this talk about, the importance of China and India and Russia, etc., a core export market for the UK is Ireland, and probably will remain Ireland because of the role of and manufactured goods and just proximity. But Paddy, if I could bring you in, because I know you've just been in Washington, maybe if you could just say a word about what the perception is in Washington about the Brexit process. I presume that Washington was restating its support for the peace process, for the Good Friday Agreement, etc. Maybe if you could just, and maybe you might maybe highlight just how important President Clinton was in the 1990s in getting the Good Friday Agreement. That's often forgotten here. It's often viewed as a kind of a bilateral EU-UK-Ireland agreement.
Okay, well, I think the big thing was which TV was most entertaining, whether it was UK TV or US TV at the time. Go back a little bit on it. Ireland is one of those unifying forces across the House in Washington, both in the Congress and the Senate. Probably not uniquely, but certainly it's one that both agree on. In fact, it was the Speaker Tip O'Neill and Democratic Speaker in the House and the then Republican President Ronald Reagan who agreed to set up the International Fund for Ireland. So there's been cross-house support for Ireland, I think since President Carter and maybe before. So it's quite significant. When you go to Washington and you're Irish, you're overwhelmed by the access. I mean, actually, the British government in Washington depend on the Irish government to get them access. That's the way, in fact, it is. So yeah, you already have in Congress the numbers that support Ireland and will block any trade deals. I think Richie Neil's chairman of the Trade Commission, and he's head of sort of the Friends of Ireland. You have lots of congressmen on both sides coming in and saying we will not agree to any trade deal that affects the Good Friday Agreement. And that's cross-party. And yesterday you had Senator Gary Harte coming out. No relation, but I'm glad he's come out. So you have voices in the Senate coming out and saying we will not agree to any trade deal that affects the Good Friday Agreement. Now, you may have seen that the Trade Secretary in the States has said we're going to do it sector by sector basis, and the reason they've said that is because the sector by sector basis does not require to go through Congress. Though the sense is, one, the full trade deals are going to be very, very difficult politically for the UK with the US. And on the other side, you get the impression that the US are just waiting for Britain to come because they're going to be so much weaker and so much easier to deal with. And that's a pill that the UK is going to have to swallow. The US is nothing like what they say it's going to be. Ireland is very well liked in the States. And I say that from someone wondering why it would be until you start going there. And it's not just a St. Patrick's Day thing, which is very good. It's very, very real. So the situation in Washington is that there's huge support in both houses and cross parties for the Anglo-Irish agreement.
Okay, that's interesting, and that's I think that's a feature that's completely lacking, certainly in the British media, about the potential for a US trade deal. But what's also interesting is that I think the realities, and it's not just I think the US that the British are getting feedback from. I think it's interesting some of the subtle announcements by the Japanese government. A lot of the Japanese car makers have production plants in the UK, set up under Thatcher in the 80s. It was probably one of her big achievements in terms of utilising the EU single market to bring FDI to previously quite economically struggling areas, particularly in the north of England, places like Sunderland and stuff. But also I think what's very interesting is India. Huge market, strong historical connections with Britain. And it's quite ironic when you think that one of the key features of the Brexiteer argument was, we need to cut the amount of immigrants that are coming to Britain. But a couple of months ago, the British government announced that they are easing the conditions for non-EU, particularly for students from India, to stay and work longer after they complete their degrees, which is interesting because EU immigration into Britain never accounted for more than 50% of total immigration into Britain. It's just one of those ironies. But Johan, if I can just ask you a question before I open it up to the floor for questions, is I think an interesting feature of UK industry is its internationalization. I think compared to the French and German economies, we've got I think one British academic described it as, it's not British business, it's where the world does business in Britain because of the level of international ownership. So I'm just wondering that as appears to be the case with the backstop in Northern Ireland, that when the British realise, just the impact that leaving the single market completely will have on British industry, and often it's a process, it's a political process that that politicians have to go through. That actually, what we will see is a EU-UK relationship that will be an awful lot closer to membership of the single market than people think. Or maybe I'm just dreaming. I don't know.
Of course, I mean, who knows what will happen, right? And you're right, we have to keep reminding people that Brexit has not happened. And I think that once the impact will be there, maybe the reactions will have to be that we'll have to negotiate something with the EU. And that's anyhow what's supposed to be in the phase 2 of the negotiations, is that then we're supposed to actually discuss about what will come after those 2 years, if we even agree on those 2 years. But I wanted to react on what you said, and you hinted to it, but the comments made by Merkel, which I think are really, really interesting. And the fact that she underlined that, well, together with the US and China, we'll have another big competitor just outside of our borders, which is the UK. Yeah. And I think that this has been underlining in the negotiations the whole time, and that's, I think, the misunderstanding that has often been in the British Parliament as well, is that why is Europe so strict on those red lines? It's not a regular negotiation. It's not a regular, you give me access to this part of your market, I'll give you access to this part of your market trade negotiation. It's a very complex negotiation where the EU is actually negotiating about its own raison d'être, its own single market and its own way of working. And the issue of level playing field has been crucial to make sure that if the UK remains somehow in a market, in an EEA economic area, in the single market, in the customs union, whatever, we will have to make sure that a level playing field can be ensured. And there's really a fear that you will have a competitor just outside of your border who will, have low tax rates, will try to exploit all the issues of being so close to Europe but having completely different policy regimes. And there has been declarations by the British government and by Boris Johnson exactly on that, saying that, well, we can rethink completely our tax regimes and our system after Brexit. So I think that there is a fear in the EU side on that, and that's why I think it's been so hard on their positions as well. When it comes to trade policy, I think that we do know that Trump has a good relationship with Boris Johnson, and maybe he likes to show that quite directly by saying that they will negotiate agreements. The issues that have been brought up for the moment are also quite technical and seems to be more in favor of the US than in favor of the UK, which is obvious because the US will negotiate hardly as well, as they always do. But at the end of the day, I think that the UK negotiating a free trade agreement with the US outside of the EU will have less than if it would have negotiated a free trade agreement inside of the EU. So, at the end of the day, that's the results of Brexit.
Okay, and just a follow-up question to the professor and to Johan. How, because we have a Norwegian and from Liechtenstein, how would the EFTA feel about Britain joining?
And there are a lot of discussions in Norway right now about the EEA agreement. So in Norway we have an EEA agreement, we're not a part of the EU, but we're part of the single market. So we apply all rules and all regulations that you have to apply if you're part of the single market. And there are quite some debates about at least some parties that are against the EU, against the EEA, that would like to leave the EEA. I'm not sure they will continue on that rhetoric after Brexit really happens. And I think that whatever happens, and that's also why the EU position was quite strong on that, is that we can't have a model which is a new model where you are part of the single market but you don't apply the same rules. So either you're part of the EU or you're outside or you're in between. You're in the similar to the EEA agreements, and there's not much in between. And if a new solution would come up, certainly many EU member states, but also some EFTA countries would be interested in looking a little bit more into that and renegotiating, which is not what the EU wants. Has very tough negotiations with Switzerland at the moment as well. So.
Yeah.
If I may add, the UK was a founding member in 1960 of the European Free Trade Association. It's an intergovernmental one, so it was always, back then, for a long time, the competitor model to the European communities. Currently, we have two kind of EFTA models, I shouldn't call it like that. As Johan said, there's the European Economic Area, the EEA, where we only have, on the EFTA side, 3 countries, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. Norway is very dominant, if I may say so. That's one of the reasons why Norway might not be happy to have the UK joining, because it will become a British organization. The operating language is still English for the same reasons. For Liechtenstein, it's less important, obviously. It's tiny. And then we have the second model, another EFTA country, which is Switzerland, which is not in the EEA, but it's a member of EFTA. And it participates in some parts, and EFTA has a very active trade policy, a bilateral one, not a supranational one like in the EU. But the Swiss model is also not, the EU has made it clear that the Swiss model is not a model for Brexit, because it has reached its end, or the end of the patience of the EU, I should say, and because they have accumulated a lot of bilateral sectoral agreements, and they have been asked by the EU in the past years to negotiate an umbrella agreement to clarify the institutional terms. So how do you update these bilateral agreements in a dynamic way? and it's on the table, and it's stuck because on the Swiss side. So
So it's the Swiss side who are okay.
they have not. Yeah, there's a domestic discussion. The government didn't want to sign it, and I think they're waiting for what's going to happen with Brexit, because there are parallel negotiations going on. They have nothing to do with each other, but there's a linkage between them, especially on the institutional parts. Whatever one might get, it will set a precedent to what the other might get,
Yes,
whether they
of
want it or not. And and I don't think the UK wants to join the EEA because it would go against several red lines that have been stipulated already by the previous May government. I mean, the free movement of persons is part of the EEA. There's an EFTA court, so there's a jurisdiction, even if it's not the ECJ. They follow each other, the two courts, so there are many red lines that this would breach, and it's based on the acquis communautaire, so on EU rules. The only advantage would be that they can have their own trade policy, but I think it's not that attractive. After membership, of course, then the Swiss model might be more attractive for the UK, I don't know. But again, it will require the agreement of the current members.
Exactly. Okay. Johan, do you want to have a final word before?
I mean, just to say, because so there's no misunderstanding, joining EFTA for the UK doesn't solve anything.
Okay.
If you join EFTA, you're a part of a union with Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, but that's it.
Yeah.
If you want to be to have a strong cooperation with the EU, you have to be in the EEA agreement. To be in the EEA agreement, so in the European Economic Area, you have to be either a member of EFTA or EU member.
Yeah.
So either you become a member of
That's what
EFTA,
the
or
treaty says,
if you
would
leave
have
the
to
EU.
change the treaty.
There's no other way
okay.
around it.
Okay, so it's not a solution as some people, or maybe it's a solution for the immediate problem and causes more problems than it would actually solve. Okay, look, I'm going to open it up for questions. So just please raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, Roland, and we have another one here. Yeah, we'll take those two to start.
Thanks very much. I'm Roland Freudenstein, Policy Director of the Martens Center, and I've got 2 points. One is a follow-up to this perspective of Singapore on Thames. It's been mentioned here, a low-tax, low-regulation Britain that in its entire economic model deliberately distances itself from Europe and therefore, of course, becomes the systemic competitor in a way. So if Britain went down that road, and this could only happen under a Tory government, that's for sure. But what would be the domestic knock-on effects then? I mean, we all know that this is this perspective of low wage and a more capitalist Britain is not exactly what most of the Brexit voters of 2016 want. And you might say that the Brexit vote was about problems that the Brexit doesn't solve. Okay, but what would be that? I mean, what kind of domestic realignment might happen as a result of the attempt to get Singapore on Thames? And second question is about the security relationship between the EU 27 and Britain after Brexit. I mean, is it all going to work through NATO? What kind of bilateral deals are possible? And to what extent might a future British government be tempted to use even that as a kind of leverage to get advantages in other fields, economically speaking?
Yeah. Okay. And I think I saw one more question here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter Schweiger, former European External Action Service. My question was also to security. I think this will be the biggest loss we will have to get to a common European defense and military forces and coordination also in the defense industry in Europe. Exactly what chances do you see that we have an agreement with the UK to participate in these future plans in Europe? And the second question would be, you haven't addressed the internal issues in the UK. So the societal division between the population, but also what will happen with Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. Will the UK stay as it is or end up in the end a much smaller England and other countries and not be as big as it has been before? Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll take those questions to start. So there was the big one was security. Britain is obviously, as a non-security expert, I would vaguely say the most capable and best equipped security partner in the EU. Professor, what do you think? Do you think that?
I would say the security partnership is now not in the focus because it's less of a problem, because both sides have clear interests to work closely together. I mean, the UK and France are the only permanent European members of the UN Security Council, for example. They have nuclear weapons, they have all these capabilities. I think there's clearly interest. I mean, there are other issues like intelligence sharing and so on, where the UK is, of course, very important. Now, the UK in the past was sometimes instrumental, for instance, together with France, setting up the CSDP. But then again, it has also put the brakes on many things. And it's often said that one of the Brexit effects was that actually the PESCO came to life, so that it gave a push for permanent structured cooperation and on defense. So, you know, it can have negative and positive effects, but I think now the focus is really to solve the economic issues. And of course the Northern Ireland issue, before they go to security. I mean, in all the papers that the UK government has published before, I mean under the May government now, afterward it became a bit more chaotic. They always talked about having very close relation on security as a mutual interest. And I sometimes had even the impression, reading the papers, I mean the documents, that the UK was prepared to go even further than they were as a member on future cooperation. I mean, and in the CFSP area, you know, there are always ways and means to cooperate on statements. You can align yourself. I mean, we have non-member countries of the EU that participate in CFSP, so I think it would be easier than if the political will is there.
Yeah, I think in the British context, I think it would be easier for British politicians to have even more cooperation in the security context as non-members of the EU, I think, for internal political reasons. Johan, do you want to say a word?
I mean, just following up on that, to a certain extent, and there have been some studies about this, Norway is even more integrated in the EU CSDP than Denmark is.
Yeah, for example.
And it's outside of the EU. So I think in terms of defense and security, I would say that the biggest effect will be on single market, on the economic element. I think that on security, if there is it was intergovernmental to a large extent. And it is intergovernmental. So if there is a willingness to cooperate on those topics, I think there will be the possibility to work on those topics. I think that will be easier to fix than the UK leaving the single markets, I think. But obviously, yes, I mean, Europe as a security player, as a defense actor, will be less powerful without the UK and without UK forces. That's obvious. So that's on the security element. On what will happen within the UK, it's, I mean, difficult to guess, and we'll have to see what happens. But it is possible, I think, that you will see a disintegration of the UK, and you will have countries that are willing to leave the UK to remain in the EU in the long term. If that will happen on the EU side, it'll be complex negotiations. But I think that the idea of the UK leaving the EU was putting all its money on the global Britain, the Commonwealth, and the strong union. Well, they might even see the disintegration of their own union. That's definitely a possibility.
Paddy, maybe do you want to say a word on maybe following on from Johan? Yeah, just the potential knock-ons for the UK internally.
I think England are beginning to face up to something that we have on the island of Ireland, and I'm sure in many other countries, about nationalism. I'm not a great fan. I'm very proud of where I come from, but there's a risk that nationalism hasn't ever ended well in Ireland. It's a very difficult time for the UK. The lines that have been drawn. Even I said two of our boys are married to English girls, British Irish passports, and I've only started that conversation with those English girls who've never actually thought whether they were English, they were just British. It never occurred to them. The question was never asked. Now they're middle class, educated girls, so they're going to work it through. It's set up a very, no matter what the outcome is, the tensions. I've been around this, the breakdown of communities along national lines for a long time. And once that genie is out of the bottle, it'll take a generation, at least a generation, for that to work itself out. I don't get any sense that Wales is going anywhere quick. I don't. I mean, you know, the Welsh have never done like the Scottish. The Scottish have always been very Scottish, and they have. I could say this with half of my family live in Scotland, that the Irish get the name of not liking the English, but you need to sit with the Scottish at a football match to realise. So I'm not sure the Scottish will do. As I say, we're in this funny position where Welsh nationalism and Scottish nationalism seem to have a nice feel to them, and English nationalism is a bad feel, and that's not a good place for England to be. It should be able to get to the point where it can express its various forms of nationalism, but that's a major post-Brexit challenge for Britain.
Yeah, I think what's interesting on Scotland is that pre the Brexit referendum, you still got whatever 45% of the Scottish population to vote for an independent Scotland. I think Nicola Sturgeon gave a very interesting speech yesterday to the SNP National Conference. It was kind of a holding speech. She's waiting to see what's going to happen. But I think what has changed is that the British or the English-based arguments about Scotland, remaining part of the Union, have turned essentially negative. It's not a positive dynamic anymore. So what the British government are saying, or what will be put out there in any further referendum campaign, will be, your pensions won't be secure, your budget won't be balanced, you won't be able to use the pound sterling, which are all essentially negative. It's, if you leave, it will be worse. And I think, as we've seen with other referendums, when you use that kind of negative approach, it can hold for only so long. But I think for people who aren't familiar with Scotland, I think there is a pervasive, and it's at a kind of a popular culture level too, a pervasive anti-English feeling that I would say doesn't exist as widespread in Ireland. At least that's my perception of it. And I think people sometimes don't understand that in certain areas, Scotland is already quite different from England in terms of, say, third level education, where they have no fees, where EU students can be educated in Scotland on the same basis as Scottish students. So it's already quite an interesting topic. There was one other question, which was, sorry.
I haven't spoken about Scotland and Wales. I didn't mention Ireland in terms of what would happen to Northern Ireland next.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
But just very, very briefly, because it's very, very complex. The issue is, will there be just a united Ireland? That's the my answer is in the short term, I hope not. Because it's not as it's a very complex thing. Not everyone in the Republic of Ireland is pro-United Ireland. Not everyone who's there are pro-union nationalists. A lot. So it would be wrong to think that the DUP and the broad term unionist community are all pro. Union. So there is an element of unionism, a very practical element of unionism that sees the benefit of trade and a single economy as being beneficial. And also a large number of nationalists are pro-union for very practical reasons. Education is free, doctors' prescriptions are free, which aren't free in England, but there are lots of things that Northern Ireland have that you don't have in England. So So what will happen in Ireland? Completely off the record, Ireland will kick this ball as far down the road as it possibly can.
Yeah, and
Not be soon.
Paddy, just to follow up on that, I've long been on the record to say that United Ireland would have catastrophic impacts on the South. Just to put a figure on it so people understand, is that Northern Ireland generally receives an annual subsidy from Westminster somewhere in the region of about £10 billion, so say about 11 billion sterling or 11 billion euros at the moment. The entire economy of Southern Ireland takes in about 40 billion in tax revenues every year. So you're already looking at about like a 25% increase in expenditures just to keep things at the status quo, not to mention all the other complicated social, cultural, economic things. It would be, in the short term, it would be an absolute economic shock. And this brings me on to Roland's question, which was, if you were to consider the impact of United Ireland in the context of where Southern Ireland's business tax regime is coming under increased pressure from the EU, the OECD, etc., which will probably see Ireland lose about 5 to 6 billion euros in tax revenue annually. And also, on Roland's point then, where you could have the remainder of the UK seeking to become a serious economic competitor. And really, I try to explain to people sometimes that the economic competitors for Ireland aren't Belgium or Sweden. They're the English-speaking Anglosphere countries that are the real competitors, such as the UK, Australia, New Zealand, etc. But just back to Roland's question, Singapore on Thames, the Tory vision of they would express it as a smaller state, lower tax rates, out-competing, more competitive than the European Union. But how do we feel that would?
Well, I think the regulatory issues are very important. Customs are not such an issue, but the focus is mainly now on this customs partnership, whatever. But the real issue are regulatory. Of course, it depends on which kind of regulatory issues you're looking at. I cannot imagine that there's an interest in the British population to have lower labor or environmental standards. I mean, okay, taxes is a different thing. The UK is also part of the OECD, by the way, so there are some limits. And it will also get into trouble with the EU. But it depends on which regulatory issues you're looking at. And it will depend again on the future partnership, because there has to now the rules are the same in the EU and the UK. The question is, are they going to diverge? Which will then, of course, also put a lot of pressure on Northern Ireland, because if you're going in different directions, the gap will grow on the rules that have to be applied. And there are lots of issues that come with that. So I would not see going there personally. They could try, but they will run into problems, I think.
Johan, do you want to have a word?
No, I agree with what you said, that it will have to be about political decisions within the UK, and that will depend on obviously on the government, on what is the willingness to implement those policies. But it is a possibility, and that's the challenge that Europe has to deal with.
I think it's also important to highlight kind of the economic context that the UK has faced over the last 10 years, because the UK was also very heavily hit by the financial crisis. Obviously, not being members of the euro, they dealt with it in-house. But I think in 2010, 2011, their deficit hit 10 or 11% of GDP. And for the last 10 years, it's been a process of reducing that deficit, which I think still is about 2%. And that's where, the Jeremy Corbyn, the opposition to Tory rule comes from, which what we have seen over the last 10 years has been very significant reductions already in government spending in the UK, government spending as a percentage of GDP or whatever. And actually the reductions over the last 10 years far outstrip anything that Thatcher might have done in the 1980s. So that has disproportionately impacted, which again is the irony of it. Those, that austerity has disproportionately impacted more disadvantaged areas, which in turn tended to vote Brexit. So it's a lose-lose situation. But we definitely, we've 2 more questions here.
Hi, my name is Brett Hag from BBVA. I'm with a small reflection. We're hearing a session on setting the course of a post-Brexit EU. Although I'm hearing a lot of discussion about post-Brexit UK, actually. So my question would be then, where do you see the main challenges for the EU? To come back a little bit to the EU. The challenges in, we've mentioned some, defense, for example, but what about particular challenges to bring forward the EU? We've discussed about disintegration of the UK. What about the integration of the EU? How could that go forward? How could the governance of the EU go forward? Maybe there are also some advantages without the UK. What has to be done? Well, I'm working for a bank, so what has to be done in financial markets, for example, without having large financial center in the EU? So where do you see the main challenges, or where should the EU go after Brexit?
Okay, thank you. And I think we have, one more.
Thank you. Alexander von Ing, former European Parliament. We spoke mainly about economy and politics. What I see already now, whether Britain stays or leaves, it will be a split society over more than a generation. And that's a big problem, not only for the United Kingdom, but also for Europe as a whole. They have a split identity, and I don't see how you can fix it fast, whatever is the result of Brexit.
Okay. We'll take one more. I think we should be able to fit it in.
Yes, thank you very much. Working? Okay. Yes, I'm George Spiro. I'm representing, not officially now, but I'm working with an inter-parents organization with 60,000 parents who are the ones of the European schools. Of course, we are pretty worried and we don't like at all the Brexit. We regret it profoundly. Of course, I don't think I can agree that the UK was a very enthusiastic member of the EU. They were not in the Schengen, they were not in many things. Euro, they had opt-outs from many directives and even making cherry picking by article. Okay, but we are friends and let them take the cherries, no problem. What was never very clear for us is, at the end, who's behind the crime, because who financed Mrs. Farage, for example? Because in order to do this kind of campaigns, you need huge amounts of money. So somebody is financing behind this. Should we suspect industrialists, or should we suspect people who are very rich? I don't know who we suspect. And then we heard at a moment the Commission talking about a plan to support the Irish economy, and not only the Irish economy, but all the others who are impacted. But then we never heard anything about that, at least as general public. And also I say that we hope that UK Brexit, no Brexit, will stay in his place, and at least for the education part, we have bilateral agreements, because for education, UK is a huge, and for research, there is a huge partner, and that will be both sides a madness to throw the baby with the water of the bath. I mean, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I think we have about 10 minutes, so we can probably get through these questions. Maybe the first question was about there are many challenges for the EU. in terms of further integration governance. So where do you think are the core challenges, Professor, if I can start with?
Okay. I think if there was one good thing about Brexit, one I can think of at least, is that it has shown all the other member states of the European Union that it might not be such a brilliant idea to withdraw. I mean, there have been talks about Frexit, Polexit, whatever exit before, but you don't hear it anymore because you just have to watch TV. So I think so, and it has also, I think you said it at the very beginning, led to quite an astonishing unity among the 27 vis-à-vis the UK, which wasn't to be taken for granted when the negotiations started. So at least there's a positive side to that. And for the future, I mean, we talked a little bit about enlargement. I think that could be one way to go. I think especially North Macedonia has done everything. It's, in my view, in a better stage than Serbia, which is negotiating. So why not open negotiations? We're not talking about membership anytime soon. It's about negotiations. Now France is blocking it. I think there's a certain fatigue also because of all the somewhat unexpected backlash that has been happening in some of the newer member states. Hungary, Poland, etc., where we have populism, we have tendencies to illiberal democracies, we have corruption in Bulgaria. I mean, all these things are not solved from the previous enlargement, and I can understand there's some hesitation to say now we're moving to the Western Balkans, but we also have to keep in mind these are small countries, not like Turkey, and they've been doing a lot of things. They have a very young population, and if the EU is not taking them in, there's a geopolitical vacuum. We have Russia there, we have Turkey there, and we have increasingly also China being present. So I think that's one of the key issues, for example. I don't want to dominate.
Perfect. Johan, if you want to have a word.
No, I really much agree with what Sieglinde just said about how astonishing it has been that Europe and the European countries have remained unanimous and kept this unity throughout the negotiations. I think there has been attempts at talking to some heads of state more directly, trying to make they say different things and make people believe that they have actually said different things. Well, they necessarily don't really have. But I think we'll have to study quite carefully, and also for academics, it'll be very interesting to study to what extent and how Europe has been able to keep this unity throughout the negotiations. I think that's been quite remarkable. On the post-Brexit EU, I think that the challenges we already mentioned, I think defense we mentioned, single market, we mentioned trade policy, we mentioned that again as well. I think that there is, and we've seen that quite quickly, I think after the first round of negotiations, declarations from France especially saying that we'll use Brexit to move ahead in many areas, we'll be more integrated, and the Brits have been blocking us on so many policies for so many years. Now we'll finally be able to complete a lot of areas. I think that that's true maybe for some areas, but I think that for the single market, not necessarily the case. I think that really by losing the UK, you really lose a strong voice for services in the single market, and I think it will be difficult to again. There's kind of a single market fatigue as well in the council, and numerous declarations saying that we will have to complete the single market. But obviously, at the end of the day, some of the proposals from the Commission are watered down in the council. So I don't necessarily think that will be easier. But on other areas, maybe we will get rid of the rebate in the MFF. I don't know.
True.
I mean, some countries are happy to keep it there, but still, that could be one of the interesting results.
Okay, thanks, Johan. Paddy, maybe there was just a question about, how Brexit will kind of split societies and stuff, and I'm just thinking in Britain, but I'm just thinking particularly in Northern Ireland, will Brexit make it even more harder to reach some sort of sustainable level of peace, I suppose?
Firstly, just the unity of all of the other 27 has been quite remarkable, and it has been a democratic process, as I've said. I'm also conscious that democratic process isn't complete. It has to go through British Parliament, so UK hasn't left yet. So post-Brexit is sometimes you can talk ourselves into, they haven't left yet, they may not leave. However, the point that was made about divisions, I was generous by saying a generation. I think that it will be much more than a generation in Britain. What it has done in Ireland, it has reopened wounds that people in mainland Europe know more about these wounds than we do in Ireland. So I'm aware of that. They're more recent. That's the only difference. Well, yeah, that's about the only difference. So those wounds and legacy issues about the past, it all settled down. The border, mostly down to the EU membership, had disappeared. It's back. It is going to make, it is now opened, let a genie out of the box. Whether Brexit happens or doesn't happen, that genie is back out of the box in Northern Ireland. At the weekend, the loyalist paramilitary groups, if you know who they are, they're a working class unionist population, have all come back on the fore. They're now visible again, and that's not a happy sign. And I'm meeting some of them next week. The big question is, how long can you keep people inside? And finally, just on that back a bit, Britain was, of course, a reluctant member of the EU. But if you'll forgive me for quoting Lyndon B. Johnson about John Edgar Hoover in the United States, it is always better to have people inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. So I would have Britain in without affecting the integrity of the single market. I think it's always better. Slightly inside the tent, where David Cameron wanted Britain to be, is much better than slightly outside the tent as a major competitor.
That's what the EPP used to say about Victor Orban.
Better have him in.
Yes, well, that's a whole different debate. I think we'll just stick to Brexit today. But I think there was the final question, and I think it is very important about education. Europe's best universities are in the UK. I think at last count, 7 or 8 of the 28 members of the European Council undertook part of their education in the UK. It is a dominant force in European education, and I think what's really ironic is that the impact of the UK was so great on the new Central and Eastern European members. Obviously, for all sorts of reasons, they opened their labour markets, free movement of economies, etc. But all those countries basically chose English as their lingua franca, and I think. That's even highlighted. I have some knowledge of the European schools. That's even highlighted in the European schools, where the demand for English instruction from Central and Eastern Europe is becoming a huge problem now if the UK leaves, because obviously the UK provided a lot of finance and teachers, etc., for the European schools. And obviously, I'm not sure if Ireland has the capability to provide that level of financing or personnel. But you would imagine that education is one of these areas where, as the speaker said, it would just be absolute insanity for unofficial or artificial borders of whatever reason to be accepted or to be erected. But I would say it's not impossible. I think we've already had the announcements of all of the British rail companies to say that they are pulling out of the Interrail scheme. So Interrail will anybody who's done that as a teenage rite of passage will no longer be able to go to the UK. But it in one way it's just a funny little aside, but also these things can have longer term impacts that people sometimes don't realise. But we're coming up to the end now. I just want to thank everybody for their attendance, for their questions. I want to thank our speakers for creating the time today. Paddy, thanks for coming from Ireland, for giving your expertise. And I would just sum up by saying this. Probably the biggest irony of Brexit is that 10 years ago, if you had said that 40 to 45% of the British population would identify readily and easily with being pro-EU, where you would have EU flags stationed outside Westminster, people would say you were crazy. And one of the interesting impacts of Brexit has been the creation of a very pro-European, pro-EU set of interest groups and political parties that would give me confidence that the EU-UK relationship in the long term, when all Brexit plays out, etc., will be perhaps a lot closer. I'm not sure if they'll be in the tent, but they might be peeking through the through the covers. So thank you very much.